The bell above the door barely made a sound when Ezra Cross walked in. It was the kind of bell that had rung 10,000 times and given up trying to matter. The shop smelled like old carpet and machine oil, and the particular sadness of things people had surrendered. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, one of them flickering at the far end of the ceiling like a dying pulse. Earl Dunbar looked up from his stool behind the bulletproof glass. He was a heavy man with small eyes and the expression of someone who had heard every story and believed none of them. He set down his newspaper. He did not say anything. He had learned long ago that people who came in during a blizzard at midnight did not need to be greeted. They needed to be processed. Ezra walked to the counter. He did not rush. He had the walk of a man who had learned that urgency was something you kept on the inside where no one could see it and use it against you. He set a small wooden box on the counter. His hands did not shake, though they wanted to. He opened the box. Inside, resting on a fold of faded cloth, was a purple heart. The bronze caught the fluorescent light and threw it back clean and indifferent. The ribbon was deep purple with a thin white stripe at each edge. It was not a reproduction. It was not a copy. It had been awarded to Staff Sergeant Ezra Cross, United States Marine Corps, in the field by a general who shook his hand and did not know his name until he read it off the citation. Dunbar leaned forward. He picked up the medal and turned it over in his fingers. He did not ask where it came from. He did not ask what it cost. He had bought 4 of these in the last 2 years. The market, he had explained to each of them, was not what it used to be. $50, Dunbar said. Ezra stood very still. He had carried that medal through 3 tours. He had carried it through Fallujah and Kandahar, in a place with no name that did not appear on any map issued to any unit. He had carried it home in his breast pocket on the transport flight, sitting upright, while the men around him slept, watching the dark ocean pass 40,000 feet below. He had carried it through everything that came after. $50. He said the word deal the way a man says it when the negotiation ended. Long before he walked through the door, he took the money. He went to the convenience rack along the wall, a few shelves bolted beside a display of hunting knives, and he bought antiseptic and gauze and 2 types of medication. The total came to $47. He pocketed the 3 that remained. He walked back out into the storm. That was the end of the story as most people would tell it. But the story did not begin there. It began 3 months earlier on an October morning when the sky was the color of old tin and Chicago still smelled like autumn. Ezra Cross had been living in a structure he had built himself on a vacant lot on the south side of the city, in a neighborhood that the city council referred to in its zoning documents as a transitional corridor, which was a phrase that meant they had not decided yet whether to ignore it or demolish it. The lot was owned technically by the city. The structure Ezra had built on one corner of it was not large. It was roughly 8 feet by 10 feet, framed with salvaged lumber and insulated with layers of plastic sheeting and closed cell foam he had stripped from a demolished building 3 blocks over. The exterior was covered with heavy-gauge tarpaulin he had found folded and abandoned behind a hardware store. He had sealed every joint with waterproof tape. It was not beautiful, but it was square. The angles were true. The floor was elevated 4 inches off the ground on a platform of treated wood, which kept the cold from conducting directly through. The interior was organized with a precision that would have seemed excessive to someone who did not understand that precision was how you held yourself together when everything else was gone. Blankets folded military style, supplies arranged by category along one wall, a battery-powered lantern conserved carefully, a small kit of tools, and on a nail above where he slept a small wooden box. Inside the box, a purple heart. Ezra had been a Marine for 22 years. He had enlisted at 18 and served until his body made the decision that his will refused to make. 3 tours, Fallujah in 2004, Ramadi in 2007, Kandahar in 2011. He had been a fire team leader, then a squad leader, then a staff sergeant, with men under his command who were young enough to be his sons. He had come home from Kandahar in 2012 with documentation of his service, a modest disability rating, and a set of lungs that were no longer reliable. The chemical exposure had been logged in his file, and then, like so many things logged in files, had been quietly set aside. He was 52 years old. He weighed 168 pounds, which was 30 less than he had weighed in Kandahar. His hair was close-cropped and mostly gray. His face carried the particular stillness of someone who had learned to observe without reacting, to measure a room before speaking in it, to trust what he saw over what he was told. He had not always been homeless. There had been an apartment after the discharge. There had been years of trying. There had been a woman named Dorothy who lasted through the first hard year before the silences and the nightmares and the way he sometimes went somewhere else in the middle of a conversation became more than love alone could carry. He did not blame her. He had said so clearly when she left, and he had meant it. There had been jobs, security work mostly, a warehouse position, a stint driving a delivery truck until the coughing became too frequent and too loud for the supervisor to ignore. Each position ended in the same manner with the same careful language about budget constraints and performance metrics, and we will keep your application on file. The apartment went when the jobs did. He had been on the lot for 11 months. In those 11 months, Ezra had submitted 24 job applications. He kept a log of each one in a small notebook with a green cover writing the date, the company name, the position, the method of application, and the outcome. 23 of those entries had the same outcome recorded in the same neat handwriting, no response or rejected or told to check back. The 24th entry was the one that had broken something very small and very important in the center of his chest. Morrison Construction had posted a position for a site supervisor on a commercial project in the West Loop. The listing had specified experience with project coordination, material logistics, and team management. Ezra had coordinated logistics for a rifle company in 2 active combat zones. He had managed teams under conditions that no construction supervisor would ever encounter. He had filled out the application with the same precision he brought to everything and submitted it in person, because he knew that submitting applications in person was one of the few remaining advantages available to someone without a reliable email connection. The woman at the front desk of Morrison Construction had looked at him the way people look at something they were not expecting and were not pleased to see. Her eyes moved from his boots to his jacket to the notebook he carried under his arm, and then back to some middle distance that did not include him. "We will call you if anything opens up," she said. The door closed behind him. Through the glass panel beside it, he could see her returning to her computer without looking up again. He stood on the sidewalk outside Morrison Construction and looked at the city. Lunch traffic moved around him. People in good coats carried cups of coffee from places that cost $5 a cup. A bus went by, and the wind from it pushed litter against his legs. He adjusted the notebook under his arm and walked. He had one more stop to make. The Veterans Affairs office on West Madison had a waiting room with plastic chairs bolted to the floor and a number dispenser by the door that rattled when you pulled from it. Ezra had been there 9 times in the past 11 months. He knew the layout. He knew which chairs had a clear line of sight to the service windows. He knew that the woman at window 3 was the one who actually read the documentation you brought. He sat for 1 hour and 40 minutes. Mrs. Patterson at window 3 was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the expression of someone who was doing her genuine best inside a system that had stopped allowing genuine bests a long time ago. She had been at that window for 16 years. She remembered Ezra from his previous visits, which was either a good sign or a sign that his case was complicated enough to be memorable. And in that office, there was not much difference between the two. She pulled up his file. She read. She did not make him feel small while she read, which was one of the reasons he had chosen window 3. The housing list, she said. You are still on it. 47 names ahead of you, he nodded. Job placement assistance, he said. She looked at him over her glasses. That program is suspended, she said. Budget reallocation. I am sorry, Ezra. I mean it, Ezra. He nodded again. He thanked her. He stood and put his jacket back on and walked to the door. He pushed it open and went back out into the October street, and he did not allow himself to stop moving because he had learned that stopping was the beginning of something he could not afford. He passed a restaurant where steam rose from a vent in the sidewalk, and the smell of roasting meat came out through the door and followed him for half a block. He passed a barbershop where 3 men were laughing at something on a television mounted to the wall. He passed a church with a marquee that read, "Do not lose heart," and he did not allow himself to have any particular feeling about that. He passed the pawn shop on West 63rd. Earl Dunbar's. The neon sign in the window read, "We buy gold, silver, jewelry metals." The word metals flickered because the E was going out. He had walked past that sign 67 times in 11 months. He had counted in the way that men who are managing something internal count things as a way of giving the mind something mechanical to do. He kept walking. Back at the lot, he sat for a while in the last of the afternoon light and opened his notebook and drew a careful line through the entry for Morrison Construction. He wrote the date. He wrote rejected, implied. He closed the notebook. He looked at the wooden box on the nail above his sleeping area. He looked at it for a long time. Then he set about the methodical work of preparing the shelter for the night. October became November. November had its own quality of cold. Not yet the deep structural cold of January, but the kind that reminded you it was coming, that issued the reminder in a tone that was not friendly. Ezra added a second layer of plastic sheeting to the north wall of the shelter. He sourced additional insulation from a demolished apartment building 4 blocks away, carrying it in 2 trips over 2 days. He cataloged his supplies with the same meticulous attention he had brought to inventory in the field. He knew what he had, he knew what he needed, he knew the distance between those 2 things precisely. He was good at knowing the distance between 2 things precisely. What he was not prepared for on a Tuesday in late November was Officer Bryce Holt. Ezra was outside the shelter sorting through material when the white patrol car pulled to the curb. He had seen patrol cars stop at the lot before. Usually they idled for a moment, the officer inside looking out through the window, and then they drove on. There was nothing technically illegal about what Ezra was doing. The lot was city property, which made his presence an administrative gray area rather than a criminal one. Most officers understood this distinction. Holt did not get out of the car immediately. He sat for a while, engine running, and Ezra did not turn to look at him. He continued sorting material. He had learned in 22 years of military service that performing your task calmly and consistently while being observed by authority was the single most effective demonstration of legitimacy available to a person without documents. The car door opened. Holt was a younger man, late 30s, with the particular physical confidence of someone who had never been in a situation he could not resolve by the weight of his uniform alone. He walked with his thumbs hooked in his belt. He looked at the shelter with an expression that was not quite disgust, but was working toward it. He held out an envelope. Ezra took it without speaking. He opened it. He read it carefully, completely, from the first line to the signature at the bottom. He was good at reading documents. He had written and received enough of them in his service to understand exactly how much was communicated by what was not said. The letter was a notice of immediate vacancy requirement issued by the Office of the Deputy Commissioner for Urban Development. It directed the occupant of the property to vacate within 48 hours to facilitate the commencement of authorized redevelopment activities. It was signed by Commissioner Harlan Voss. Ezra looked up. "This is a vacant lot," he said. "The city has not had an active redevelopment plan for this property in 11 months. Holt looked at him with the expression of a man performing patience he did not feel. "The notice speaks for itself," Holt said. Ezra folded the letter and put it in his jacket pocket. He turned back to his sorting. What happened next did not take long. Holt stepped around him to the entrance of the shelter. He pulled back the tarpaulin at the doorway and looked inside. Then he did something that Ezra would not forget. He took hold of the vertical support post on the left side of the entrance frame, and he pushed. Not hard enough to collapse the structure, just hard enough to make the frame shift to compromise the tension in the sealed joint at the top corner, to pull a section of the weatherproofing tape loose, just enough to let the cold in. He let go of the post. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Ezra. 48 hours, Holt said. He walked back to his car. He drove away. Ezra stood for a moment without moving. He looked at the shelter. He looked at the corner where the tape had pulled loose. He looked at the sky, which was the color of dirty concrete and moving in a way that had nothing casual about it. Then he got his tools and he fixed what Holt had broken. He sealed the joint. He reinforced the corner with an additional brace. He checked the integrity of every other joint in the frame while he was at it. He worked with the focus and economy of motion that came from doing difficult things in conditions that did not wait for you to feel ready. When he was done, he sat inside the shelter in the last light of the afternoon and he opened his notebook. He wrote the date. He wrote the officer's name, which he had memorized from the badge. He wrote the name, Commissioner Harlan Voss, which he had read from the signature. He wrote property seizure, redevelopment, pretext investigate. He closed the notebook. Outside, the first real wind of the night was beginning. He did not know yet that what was beginning was not just the wind. The National Weather Service had issued its warning at 4 in the afternoon. The language of the warning was the language of institutions when they want to communicate severity without creating panic, which is to say it used a great many specific numbers in a small number of words like significant and hazardous and life-threatening. Wind speeds of 50 miles per hour, temperatures dropping to -20 Fahrenheit by midnight, a blizzard in the technical and literal sense of that word. Ezra had been in conditions that were worse. He had been in a compound in Helmand province in January of 2011 when a storm reduced visibility to zero for 60 hours and the temperature dropped to levels that the thermometers they had were not calibrated to measure. He had maintained his equipment and his unit and his own internal temperature through all 60 of those hours by doing what he always did in conditions designed to break people. He reduced the problem to its components. He addressed each component in order. He did not allow himself to think about the aggregate. He could do this. He reinforced the shelter one final time as the light failed. He sealed the base of the structure against drifting snow with sandbags he had been storing for this purpose. He verified his supply inventory. He had 3 days of food, which was minimal but sufficient. He had enough chemical heat packs to maintain survivable temperature for 48 hours if he was disciplined about their use. He had water he had stored in insulated containers. He would be cold. He would be uncomfortable. But he had a structure that would hold, and he had the training and the discipline to manage the hours inside it. What he had not calculated was his own body. The cough had started 3 weeks earlier. He had managed it the way he managed everything by acknowledging it, monitoring it, and refusing to allow it to alter his assessment of his own capability. But in the week leading up to the storm, something had shifted in his chest, a heaviness that was not simply cold or exertion that sat behind his sternum with a weight that did not respond to discipline. By the time the temperature dropped to -10 and the wind was pulling at the walls of the shelter with the steady insistence of something that wanted in Ezra Cross was running a fever. He knew it the way you know things about your own body after 52 years, the way the skin feels when it is both too hot and too cold at the same time, the particular quality of exhaustion that comes not from exertion, but from the body consuming itself in a fight being waged on the inside. He pressed the back of his hand to his forehead. He looked at the small thermometer on his wristwatch. The reading it gave him was only approximate, but it was not a reading that suggested maintenance. It was a reading that suggested a problem. He coughed. He pressed his mouth closed with his fist. When he took his fist away, there was blood. He looked at it for a moment. He had seen blood in many contexts. He understood what this context meant. He cleaned his hand on a cloth. He lay down and pulled the blanket over himself and focused on breathing steadily and not thinking about what was happening in his lungs. Outside, the city of Chicago disappeared into white. In the dark of the shelter, with the wind making sounds along the walls that were almost like voices, Ezra Cross went somewhere else in his mind, the way he sometimes did when the present became too heavy. He went to Kandahar. He went to 2011. He went to a road that had not been a road on a night that had not had any business being as quiet as it was. The squad had been in the third vehicle of a 4-vehicle convoy, a route clearance operation through a district that intelligence had assessed as moderately hostile, which in that particular district at that particular time meant significantly hostile with the serial numbers filed off. The road was packed, earth-hard and reliable under the daylight hours, and less so after dark when you could not see the variations in the surface texture that told a trained eye where it had been disturbed. The IED was command detonated. The blast took the vehicle in front of them. Ezra's Humvee stopped. The world outside the glass was fire and dust and the particular sound of a situation in which the training takes over because the mind cannot process fast enough. He was out of the vehicle before the vehicle had fully stopped moving. He was moving toward the burning Humvee before the secondary debris had finished falling. There were 2 men in the vehicle. One of them was Corporal Danny Reeves, who was already out, who was on his hands and knees on the road 20 feet from the vehicle, who would live. The other was Private First Class Colt Garner, who was still inside, who was pinned by the collapsed roof support on the driver's side, who was conscious, and whose voice Ezra could hear through the smoke, saying something that was not quite words. Ezra went in. He went into the burning vehicle through the rear hatch, which had been blown partially open by the blast, and he worked his way forward through the smoke and heat and got his hands on Colt Garner's arm and pulled. Colt was pinned hard. The roof support had him by the left leg. Ezra braced his feet against the floor and pulled with everything he had, and the roof support shifted 3 inches and then stopped. He repositioned. He pulled again. The vehicle was burning in earnest now. The heat was the kind that removes options quickly. He got Colt free. He dragged him out through the rear hatch. He was 10 feet from the vehicle when the fuel cell went. The pressure wave put both of them on the ground. Ezra came up first. He got his arms under Colt Garner and he moved them both away from the vehicle to the point where the medic could reach them. Colt Garner had a broken leg, burns on his left arm and neck, and a look in his eyes that Ezra recognized as the look of someone who was deciding whether to stay. Ezra had put his hand on the side of the young man's face and said the only thing he could think to say, which was that they were going to need him to stick around. Colt Garner had lived, for 2 months at least. He had been transferred to Bagram, and then to Germany, and then to Walter Reed, and the leg had healed, and the burns had healed, and everyone had said he was doing well. Because in the particular language of that time and that place, doing well meant still alive. And then one morning in February, Colt Garner had not been alive anymore. He had been 23 years old. The report had said cardiac event related to injuries sustained in theater. Ezra had read the report 3 times the way he read documents when they told him something he was not ready to believe. He had written a letter to Colt's family. He did not know who they were beyond the name Garner and a home address in Ohio. He had written it carefully and mailed it to that address. He had never received a reply. In the dark of the shelter with his fever climbing and the wind howling and 12 years between that road and this moment, Ezra Cross pressed his eyes shut and let the memory finish playing and then pulled himself back to the present. He had gotten to that address in Kandahar for a reason. He stayed in the present by focusing on the sound of the wind. Specific sounds. The way it changed pitch as it moved around the corner of the structure. The rhythm of it. He had done this in foxholes. He had done this in buildings that were not safe. He did it now. He was not sure how much time had passed when he heard the other sound. It was not the wind. The wind had a quality that was continuous, that built and receded in cycles. This was different. This was sharp and specific and final. Metal against something hard, a skidding contact, a compression of force against an immovable surface, and then a sound like a large thing coming to rest. Then silence that was different from the wind silence. Ezra was on his feet before he had made a conscious decision to stand. His body did this. It had been trained to do this. He had the flashlight in his hand from the ledge where he kept it, and he was pulling back the tarpaulin at the entrance and stepping outside before his mind had fully caught up with what he was doing. The cold hit him like a door being closed on his face. The wind was 40 miles per hour and blowing sideways. The snow was horizontal, thick enough to reduce visibility to almost nothing. He swept the flashlight in an arc across the lot, across the street, and at the edge of its reach, maybe 20 feet away, at the boundary of the lot where it met the sidewalk, he saw it. A motorcycle, on its side in a snowbank, the front wheels still turning slowly, grinding against the concrete curb beneath the snow. Beside it, a shape, a large shape. He moved toward it, hunched against the wind, the flashlight cutting a narrow path through the white. He knelt. The shape was a man, a very large man, broad across the shoulders, wearing a leather jacket that was doing nothing now against the cold. He was face down in the snow. Ezra pressed 2 fingers against the side of his neck. There was a pulse. It was not strong. It was the pulse of a body that had been dealing with negative 20 degrees for longer than a body could afford. Ezra looked at the man. He looked back at his shelter. He looked at the sky, which was not a thing you could look at in any meaningful sense because it was indistinguishable from the storm. He looked at the man again. He thought about the medical kit inside the shelter. He thought about his own fever, which was burning behind his eyes and turning the edges of his vision soft. He thought about his own supply inventory, which was enough for one person for 3 days. He did not think about any of this for very long. He got his arms under the man's shoulders and he began to move. The man was enormous, 6'4", maybe more, and the kind of solid that came from a life of physical work rather than a gym. Ezra calculated his weight at 250, maybe 260. In a medical evacuation scenario, this would have been a 2-person carry. Ezra had 1 person. He used what he had. He dragged. He got his weight low and his center of gravity over his heels, and he pulled steadily one step and then another, breaking the drag into increments small enough that each one was possible. The snow resisted. The wind pushed back. His fever made the world tilt at intervals. Twice he went down to one knee and had to push himself back up from the ice. He thought about Colt Garner. He thought about the weight of a man who needed to be moved and the way your arms burn and the way you keep pulling anyway because the alternative is something you decided not to consider the moment you stepped outside. He got the man to the shelter. Getting him through the entrance was harder. Ezra had to reposition twice, working the man's bulk through the frame with the precision of someone who had loaded equipment into small spaces under difficult conditions. He settled him inside on the floor, away from the cold wall. He stood over him for a moment, catching his breath. The man's lips were the color of slate. The gash above his right eyebrow was bleeding steadily, the blood already dark and cold. His breathing was shallow. His jacket was soaked through, and his core temperature, Ezra could feel it when he pressed his hand to the man's neck, was dangerously low. Ezra began working. He pulled the man's jacket open to assess for other injuries. He ran his hands down the ribs, checking for the irregularity of breaks. He checked the legs. He tilted the head back slightly to clear the airway. He worked quickly and methodically, hands that had done this before in conditions that were also not ideal. He pulled the jacket away from one shoulder to get a better look at it. The leather was custom. Even soaked and damaged, you could see that. The stitching was heavy and precise. The patches on it had the permanence of things that had been earned rather than purchased. Ezra turned the jacket to see the chest. The Hells Angels patch was large and clear. The rocker at the top read Chicago. The rocker at the bottom confirmed the chapter. And below the primary patch, stitched in heavy silver thread on black leather, a single word: President. Ezra looked at the word for a moment. He looked at the man on the floor of his shelter, at the color of his lips, at the gash still bleeding above his eye, at the chest barely rising and falling. He set the jacket aside. He took the blanket from his own sleeping area and he covered the man with it. He checked the pulse again. Still there. Still weak, but there. He stood up. He looked at the wooden box on the nail above where he slept. He looked at it the way he had looked at it 67 times from the outside of the pawn shop on West 63rd. He took it down. He opened it. He looked at the purple heart inside it for what might have been a full minute. Then he put it in his jacket pocket, the jacket he had just put back on because he was going back outside. The man on the floor of his shelter was the president of a Hells Angels chapter and probably had resources that most people did not have, and none of that was relevant to the next 60 seconds. What was relevant was that the man was cold and bleeding and needed medication that Ezra did not have. He had $50 worth of something left to trade. He stepped outside. The cold this time was different. When you are already weakened, when you are running a fever and your lungs are compromised, and you have already spent an hour dragging 260 pounds through packed snow, the cold is not just a physical condition. It has intention. It identifies the places where your resistance is lowest, and it works at them patiently like a man who has all night. Ezra walked. He kept his head down and his hand over his mouth to capture some warmth from his own breath. He counted blocks. He had learned in the desert that counting things gives the mind an axis to organize around when everything else is disorienting. 1 block. 2. The wind hit him broadside at the intersection of West 63rd, and he stopped, planted his feet, and waited for it to pass before crossing. Earl Dunbar's neon sign was ahead. The bell barely made a sound when Ezra Cross walked in. He set the wooden box on the counter. Dunbar opened it. Dunbar turned the metal over in his fingers. The market was not what it used to be. $50. Ezra said the word deal. He bought what he needed, $47. He pocketed $3. He walked back out. The return was harder than the walk there. His body had spent whatever reserve the first trip had left, and the cold had consolidated its positions in the time he was inside. His vision at the edges was not reliable. He coughed once into his sleeve and did not look at the sleeve afterward. 1 block. 2 blocks. He thought about Rodriguez, who had been his corporal in Ramadi, who had a wife named Teresa and a daughter he had never met who had died in the second week of that deployment, with the particular unfairness of someone who had survived everything harder that came before it. He thought about Colt Garner. He thought about the faces of people he had promised to bring back and had. He thought about the ones he had not. He reached the lot. He pushed through the entrance of the shelter and knelt beside the man on the floor. The man was shivering now, which was better than not shivering. Shivering meant the body was still fighting. Ezra opened the antiseptic in the gauze. He cleaned the gash above the man's eye with the precision of the field medic training he had completed in 2003 and never forgotten, because the kind of knowledge that saves lives is the kind that locates itself in the hands rather than in the mind. He sutured nothing. He did not have the tools. He used butterfly closures cut from the gauze and pressed the wound together firmly and held it until it settled. He wrapped the head with the remaining gauze tight, but not constrictive. He crushed 2 of the antibiotic tablets between 2 flat stones he used as cooking surfaces, mixed them to a rough powder, and dissolved them in a small measure of water. He spooned this into the man's mouth, slowly tilting the head to encourage swallowing. Most of it went down. He checked the pulse. Stronger. Still not strong, but the difference was measurable. He sat back. His fever was worse. He could feel it as a kind of brightness behind his eyes, a heat that came from the wrong direction. His hands were finally shaking, which they had not done while he was working, because they were professional enough not to shake while there was work to do. There was only one blanket. He looked at the man on the floor. He looked at the blanket. He looked at what this meant logistically and practically, and from the perspective of someone who was responsible for keeping 2 people alive through a night that was going to last several more hours. He lay down beside the man and pulled the blanket over both of them. The man was generating some heat now. Not much, but some. Ezra matched his breathing to the slow rhythm of the man beside him and focused on maintaining his own temperature through proximity and stillness. He had shared warmth this way before in mountains, in circumstances where the alternative to another body's heat was none. After a while, the man stirred. Not fully. He was still unconscious in the way of someone whose body had turned off the non-essential systems to protect the essential ones. But his lips moved. Words came out broken and quiet, the particular fragments of speech that emerged from the unreachable place between consciousness and sleep. Colt, the man said. His voice was a ruined thing, barely above a breath. Then I am sorry. Then nothing more. Ezra lay in the dark with the storm pressing at the walls and the man's broken apology still in the air above them. He stared at the ceiling of the shelter. He thought about a name. He thought about the word sorry said to someone who could not hear it. He understood what that felt like. He put his hand briefly on the man's shoulder. Not to comfort. The man was unconscious, and comfort was not something he was capable of receiving. Just to say you are here. You are still here. Stay. Outside, the blizzard reached the peak of its force. Chicago disappeared. The lot disappeared. The shelter was a small, improbable warmth in the center of a world that had turned entirely white. Ezra Cross closed his eyes and kept breathing. The storm did not end so much as it exhausted itself. By 5 in the morning, the wind had dropped from something that had intention to something that merely persisted. The snow was still falling, but falling straight now without the lateral violence of the night before. Chicago was quiet in the way that cities are quiet after something has happened to them. A silence that is not peaceful, but suspended, waiting to see what comes next. Ezra had not slept. He had drifted several times into something adjacent to sleep, a shallow place where the body rests without fully releasing its watch, and each time he had come back to the same cold and the same dim light, and the same large man breathing steadily beside him. The breathing had normalized somewhere around 3 in the morning, losing the shallow irregularity that had concerned him and settling into something deeper and more reliable. That was the only development worth noting in the hours between midnight and dawn, but it was a significant one. The fever had not broken. It had settled into a steady, merciless plateau, the kind that does not spike dramatically, but simply maintains itself at a level that makes everything require more effort than it should. Thinking required more effort. Moving required more effort. Keeping his assessment of the situation accurate required more effort, which was the one he could least afford to lose. He sat up carefully when the light through the plastic sheeting shifted from black to gray. He checked the man's pulse. Strong now, genuinely strong. He checked the bandage on the head wound. The bleeding had stopped the closures holding. He pressed 2 fingers lightly to the man's wrist for a longer count. 62 beats per minute, steady. He was going to live. Ezra stood and rolled his shoulders and took stock of himself with the same clinical detachment he had just applied to his patient. His own pulse was elevated. His temperature was still wrong. His lungs, when he breathed deeply, produced a sound from somewhere inside that reminded him of wet paper. He had $3 and no medication remaining for himself. He had a body that had spent the night doing things it was not currently equipped to do. He would deal with this in order. He was heating water on the small camp stove, the last of his fuel, when he heard it. It was distant at first, and he thought it was the city resuming the ordinary mechanical sounds of morning in a neighborhood that never went fully quiet. But it grew. It grew with a specificity and a direction that ordinary city noise did not have. It was coming from the street. It was coming from multiple sources. And it was the particular sound of large displacement engines, the deep resonant note of Harley-Davidson Fight twins, not one or two, but many approaching, in what his trained ear identified as coordinated movement. He set down the cup. He pulled back the tarpaulin and looked out. The street at the edge of the lot was filling with motorcycles. Not rushing, not chaotic, moving in formation, 2x2 headlights cutting through the gray morning air, pulling to the curb in a sequence that suggested practice rather than accident. He counted quickly, 12, then 20, then more coming around the corner, the sound building until it occupied the entire street, and the buildings on both sides were throwing it back. 40 bikes, 40 riders, all of them in Hell's Angels colors. They cut their engines almost simultaneously, the way a military unit stands down on a single command, and the silence that replaced the sound was something you could feel in your chest. A man dismounted from the lead bike. He was large, but not with the bulk of someone who carried weight. With the kind of solidity that accumulates over decades of physical work, the kind that is structural rather than decorative. He was in his late 40s, with a beard going gray at the edges and eyes that were the particular shade of pale blue that looks almost colorless in winter light. He wore the full Hell's Angels colors, and on his chest the same patches Ezra had read in the dark the night before. He moved across the lot with the deliberate stride of someone accustomed to entering situations that required him to be the center of them. He stopped at the entrance to the shelter. He looked at the structure for a moment. He looked at the careful construction of it, the sealed joints, the reinforced corners, the elevated floor. His expression did not change, but something in it shifted in a way that was not nothing. Then he looked at Ezra. Ezra looked back. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Behind the man, the 40 riders stood beside their bikes in the gray morning air, and none of them spoke either. The silence of them was a different kind of silence from the storm silence. It was the silence of people waiting for someone specific to act. The man said, "Where is he?" It was not a question in the well that most questions are questions. It was a statement with a rising inflection, the kind that comes from someone who has spent a long time being the person whose questions get answered. Ezra stepped aside from the entrance. The man went in. Ezra followed. Inside, the man knelt beside the sleeping figure and put his hand on the side of his face in a gesture so immediate and unguarded that Ezra looked away. He heard the man's breath change, a single controlled exhalation that carried more in it than most speeches. Then nothing for a moment. Then the voice low and even. "He is breathing." It was not addressed to Ezra. It was addressed to the room or to himself or to something larger than either. He stood. He turned. He looked at Ezra with the full weight of those pale eyes, and Ezra returned the look in the way he had learned to return the looks of commanding officers who were deciding how much of what they were seeing they could trust. The man said, "Who are you?" Ezra told him his name. His full name, Ezra Cross, Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, retired. The man's name was Wade Garner. Most people called him Iron. He did not offer this information immediately. He asked his questions first the way a man does when he has learned that information given before questions are answered is information given to someone whose trustworthiness has not yet been established. He asked how long the man had been outside before Ezra found him. He asked what injuries he had identified. He asked what treatment had been administered and with what materials. He asked each question in sequence and listened to the complete answer before asking the next one, which was the habit of someone who had learned that partial information was more dangerous than no information. Ezra answered each question completely and accurately. He did not summarize. He did not editorialize. He gave the information as he would have given it in a field debrief, factually, and in the order in which events had occurred. When he finished, Wade Garner looked at him for a long moment. Then he said Afghanistan. It was not a question either. Ezra said yes. 3 tours. The last one in Kandahar in 2011. Something changed in Wade Garner's face. It was not a dramatic change. It was the kind of change that happens to a face that has been trained to control itself, a small seismic event that the surface manages to contain, but that reveals briefly the pressure of what is happening underneath. His eyes went somewhere for a moment. Not far, but somewhere. He said, "What unit?" Ezra told him. Wade Garner sat down on the floor of the shelter, which given his size and the status implicit in the 40 men waiting outside was an unusual thing to do. He sat down the way a man sits when the information he has just received has rearranged something fundamental about his relationship to the room he is in. He said Kandahar. Route clearance, November 2011. He said it as though he were reading from a document he had memorized. Ezra said yes. Wade Garner was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the sounds from outside, the shift of boots on ice, the occasional low exchange between the men at the bikes became the dominant sound in the shelter. Then he said Colt Garner was my brother. The shelter was very small and the word brother filled all of it. Ezra looked at the man across from him. He looked at the pale eyes and the gray in the beard, and the hands resting on his knees, large and scarred, in the particular way of hands that have done difficult work in difficult places. He thought about the voice he had heard in the dark, broken, and barely above a breath. Colt, I am sorry. He thought about a letter he had written to an address in Ohio and never received a reply to. He said I pulled him out of the vehicle. Wade Garner said I know. He told me. In the letters he wrote from Walter Reed, he told me what you did and what you looked like and what you said to him. He said you put your hand on his face and told him he needed to stick around. A long pause. He said, I have been wondering for 12 years who you were. Ezra did not know what to say to this. He had spent 12 years thinking about Colt Garner in the way you think about the ones you got out, but could not keep the particular category of loss that does not fit cleanly anywhere because the person was alive when they left your hands. He had not thought about what it meant to the family. Or he had thought about it, but from a distance that felt necessary. He said, I wrote to your family. I did not know who would receive it. Wade said I received it. I was in Ohio. I was the one who received it. Another silence. Outside, one of the bikes shifted on its kickstand. Someone coughed. The ordinary sounds of men waiting. Wade Garner said, you saved his life in that vehicle. He said it clearly and without decoration, the way men of a certain generation and a certain experience say things that matter to them, not as an opening to a longer speech, as a statement of a fact that had been sitting 12 years without a place to be said. Ezra said, not for long enough. Wade nodded. He did not argue with this because he understood that it was not an argument. It was a man describing the specific geography of something he had been living with. He said the cardiac event was 3 months after Walter Reed. The doctors said the blast damage to his heart was not detected in the initial evaluation. He said it as though he had said it many times, but that saying it many times had not worn it smooth. Ezra said, I did not know that. The report I received was brief. Wade said the reports they give families are always brief. The man on the floor, who was Wade's brother in the Hells Angels chapter, and not in blood, though, the distinction in that world was perhaps less significant than it would be in others, stirred slightly. His color was better. The gray had gone out of his lips and been replaced by something closer to the right shade. His breathing was deep and regular. Wade looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Ezra. He said, you sold your medal. It was not a question. The wooden box was empty and visible on the ledge where it lived, the felt interior showing the impression of something that was no longer there. Ezra said I needed the medication. Wade said for him. Ezra said yes. Wade was quiet for a long time, long enough that Ezra began to think the conversation had moved to a phase that did not require words. Then Wade stood. He had a phone in his hand, and he made 2 calls in rapid succession, both of them short, both of them in the particular compressed language of someone who gives instructions to people who do not need them explained. A doctor was coming. The best one the chapter had, which Wade said in a way that suggested this was not a low bar. A truck was also coming with supplies. Ezra said he appreciated it. Wade looked at him with those pale eyes and said, you kept him alive in -20 with a fever using $47 worth of drugstore supplies. Do not thank me for sending a doctor. Then he went outside to speak with his men. Ezra stayed inside with the man on the floor whose name he still did not know, and watched the breathing and the color and waited. The doctor arrived 20 minutes later, a compact and efficient man in his 60s named Rafferty, who had the hands of a surgeon and the manner of someone who had treated injuries in conditions that were not sterile and had made his peace with this fact. He examined the man on the floor with thorough speed, which is the particular skill of emergency medicine, and confirmed what Ezra's assessment had indicated. Broken ribs, 2 of them. Mild concussion. Hypothermia treated and resolving. The head wound, he said, looking at Ezra's bandaging work, had been closed correctly. He said this without additional comment, but in a tone that registered it. He also looked at Ezra. He looked at him the way a doctor looks at someone who is not the patient, but probably should be. He said, "When did the fever start?" Ezra told him. Rafferty pressed a stethoscope to Ezra's back and listened. His expression during the listening was professionally neutral, which was its own kind of information. He administered an injection from his bag, antibiotic, he said, and handed Ezra a course of tablets in a small bottle. He said, "You have pneumonia, early stage. The tablets are for 10 days. Take them on schedule." Ezra said, "What do I owe you?" Rafferty said, "Wade will handle it." Then he went back to his patient. Outside, the morning had arrived fully. The sun was not visible, the sky still a uniform gray, but the light was the light of day rather than the light of a storm, flat and honest and sufficient. The 40 riders had not left. They stood or sat in small groups, some of them with coffee from containers that had appeared from somewhere, talking in the low tones of men who were comfortable with waiting because they had done a great deal of it. Ezra stood at the entrance to the shelter and looked at them, and they looked at him. One of them separated from a group near the back. He was a large man, larger than most of the others, with a shaved head and a jaw that suggested a history of impact and a gray beard cut close. He wore the vice president patch on his colors. He stopped a few feet from Ezra and looked at him with an evaluation that was not friendly. His name was Axel Briggs. He had been Wade's vice president for 11 years, which was a long time in any organization, and a very long time in one where the position required the specific combination of judgment and capability that Axel had consistently demonstrated. He was not a man given to sentiment, and he was not a man given to quick trust, and both of these qualities had served the chapter well on multiple occasions. He said, "You saw every face here this morning." Ezra said, "I did." Axel said, "We do not know who you are." Ezra said, "I know that." Axel looked at him. The look was not hostile in the simple sense. It was the look of someone doing a calculation that had several variables and was not yet complete. He said, "Wade says you were in Kandahar, that you pulled Colt out of the vehicle." Ezra said, "That is correct." Axel said Colt was not just a name to us. Ezra said, "I understand." Axel said, "I am not sure you do." He was 23 years old. He had been a prospect for 6 months. He had never even gotten his full patch. Ezra looked at Axel steadily. He said he was scared in that vehicle. He was 23 years old and he was pinned, and the vehicle was burning and he was scared. Most people would have been. He held it together anyway. He did not let the fear determine what he did. You do not do that by accident. You do that because of who you are. Axel was quiet for a moment. The calculation behind his eyes continued. He said, "Wade trusts you." Ezra said, "Wade does not know me well enough to trust me. He knows what I did in one situation 12 years ago. That is not the same as trust." Axel looked at him for a long moment. Then something shifted in the set of his jaw. Not softening, not warmth, but the specific shift of a man who has just filed a piece of information in a place that will affect future calculations. He said, "We will see." He went back to his group. Wade came back from his conversations with his men and stood beside Ezra in the entrance to the shelter. He looked at the lot, at the bikes, at the gray sky above the neighborhood. He said, "I want to do something for you." Ezra said, "I appreciate that, but I do not need anything." Wade said, "You have pneumonia and you are living in a structure made of scrap wood, in a lot the city is trying to take from you in January in Chicago. Everyone needs something." Ezra said, "I needed to earn real work, paid at the appropriate rate. Nothing more than that." Wade looked at him. He said, "Morrison Construction." Ezra said, "That is not your concern. I submitted an application and it was declined in the way applications are declined when the person reviewing them does not take the time to read what is in them. Wade said Morrison Construction is my company. A brief pause. He said the receptionist who turned you away does not work there anymore. Ezra processed this. He said, I do not want a position created for me. Wade said, I have a foreman position open on a West Loop project. It has been open for 6 weeks because every person I have interviewed for it has been unable to read a logistics plan without having it explained to them. The position is real. The pay is correct. The work will be harder than what most people can manage. Ezra said, I can manage it. Wade looked at him with something that was close to the beginning of respect. He said, I know. What happened next arrived without warning, which is how the things that Commissioner Harlan Voss arranged tended to arrive. He had a gift for timing, which is the thing that separates an ambitious man from a dangerous one. The patrol car came from the east, moving slowly, which was the movement of a vehicle that was performing rather than responding. 2 more came behind it, and then a fourth, and then a vehicle that was not a patrol car, but a city official's sedan dark gray official plates. And slightly behind the sedan, a van with a satellite dish on top and a logo on its side that Ezra recognized as a local television news station. The camera crew was setting up before the cars had fully stopped. Officer Bryce Holt got out of the lead patrol car. He was wearing his dress uniform rather than his standard patrol uniform, which was a detail that told Ezra everything he needed to know about the nature of this visit. This was not an enforcement action. This was a production. Commissioner Harlan Voss emerged from the sedan. Voss was a trim man in his mid-50s with silver hair worn slightly long for a city official, the kind of hair that suggested careful attention paid to the impression of not paying careful attention. He wore a charcoal overcoat and a city-issued identification lanyard that caught the camera light in a way that was probably not accidental. He had the face of a man who had spent 20 years in rooms where the narrative was more important than the facts, and it showed in the particular way he arranged himself before the camera was fully rolling. He smiled at the camera. He said in the manner of a man making a public statement, he had prepared and rehearsed that the city was committed to ensuring the safety of all residents, and that the presence of unauthorized structures on city property, combined with the gathering of known criminal organizations in residential areas, represented a clear public safety concern that the Office of the Deputy Commissioner was obligated to address. He said the word criminal organizations with the care of a man who has consulted a lawyer about exactly how many times and in what context he could say it before a camera. The 40 riders had not moved. They were watching Voss with the collective stillness of people who had been in situations where reacting was exactly what was being invited and had learned not to accept the invitation. Wade stood beside Ezra and said nothing. Holt walked toward Ezra with the specific, measured stride of a man performing an arrest for an audience. He held the handcuffs in a way that ensured they were visible to the camera. He stopped in front of Ezra. He said, Elijah Cross, you are being placed under arrest for unlawful occupancy of city property and vandalism of city infrastructure. Ezra said, the second charge is fabricated and we both know it. Holt said, you have the right to remain silent. The handcuffs went on. Ezra did not resist. He stood straight, his hands behind him, and he looked at Holt with the look of a man who was storing information rather than expressing feeling. He had learned in the military that the moment of restraint was not the moment to act. The moment to act was later in the environment where acting was possible, and the terms were yours to set. He turned his head and looked at Wade. Wade was looking at Holt, then at Voss, then at the camera. His jaw was set and his eyes were the color of ice over deep water. Then Holt reached into Ezra's jacket pocket and said, what is this? And pulled out the small bottle of antibiotic tablets that Rafferty had given him 40 minutes before. He held the bottle up. He looked at the camera. He said, we also appear to have a controlled substance situation here. The bottle had a pharmacy label on it. The label had Rafferty's name on it, and the medication name, and the date, and the dosage instructions. These were facts that Holt was electing not to read aloud, which was a choice that said a great deal about the kind of officer Bryce Holt was. Ezra said, that is a prescribed antibiotic administered by a physician this morning for a documented pneumonia diagnosis. Holt said, we will sort that out at the station. He walked Ezra toward the patrol car. What happened then did not happen loudly. It happened quietly, which made it more effective than noise would have been. The 40 riders did not move toward Holt. They did not shout. They did not make any gesture of aggression or threat. They simply repositioned with the unhurried coordination of people who had practiced moving together in situations that required precision, and when they had finished repositioning, they formed a line along the street facing the patrol cars. 40 men in Hells Angels colors, standing in the January cold, not blocking the cars, not impeding the arrest, simply being visible in the specific way that 40 people who have decided to be visible are visible. The camera swung toward them. Voss, who had been preparing a follow-up statement for the camera, looked at the camera swinging away from him, and his expression did something involuntary that the camera did not catch because it was no longer pointed at him. Wade walked to a position where the camera could clearly see his face and his patches. He stood with his arms at his sides. He looked directly into the lens. He said, "We are waiting for our brother." 7 words. He said them without raising his voice, without theater, without any of the accessories that public statements usually carry. He said them the way you say something that does not need anything added to it because it is already complete. The camera held on him for a long moment. In the patrol car, Ezra sat with his hands cuffed behind him and his back straight and his fever burning steadily behind his eyes. Through the window, he could see the line of riders, the gray morning light on the chrome Wade's face turned toward the camera. He could see Voss on the other side of the car, speaking to someone on his phone, the charcoal overcoat less composed than it had been 5 minutes ago. He could see Holt in the front seat, and he could see the moment when Holt registered the shift in the situation, the way the visible weight of public attention rearranged itself, and Holt's jaw tightened in the way of someone who has executed a plan and is beginning to understand that the plan did not account for something. The car pulled away. The interview room at the district station had been painted the same institutional green at some point in the 1980s and had not been changed since, which gave it the quality of a room that had stopped caring about itself. The table was metal bolted to the floor. The chair across from Ezra was empty. He sat with his hands in front of him now, the cuffs removed, and he waited. He was good at waiting, you saw him. He used the time the way he used all time that did not have a specific task attached to it. He organized. He went through what he knew. He went through what he needed to know. He went through the sequence of events in the order they had occurred and identified the points at which the situation could be changed and the points at which it could not. The antibiotic bottle was the point that concerned him. Not the arrest itself. The unlawful occupancy charge had no real teeth. The lot was a gray area. Any competent review would see that. But the implied controlled substance issue, even if resolved, left a residue. It left the kind of residue that appears in background checks, in housing applications, in the databases that employers consult when they want a reason to decline someone they were already inclined to decline. Voss understood this. Voss had designed it to work this way. You did not need the charge to stick. You needed it to exist briefly in the record. You needed the residue. Ezra thought about this with the methodical attention he brought to terrain analysis. You looked at what the ground was. You looked at what advantages it gave to whom. Then you found the approach that the terrain had not accounted for. He thought about the antibiotic bottle. The bottle had a pharmacy label. The label had information on it. Prescription medication dispensed under a physician's name was a documented chain. The chain could be verified. The moment of verification was the moment Holt's narrative collapsed, not as a legal matter which would take time, but as a factual matter which happened instantly, in which in the presence of a camera that was still outside and presumably still rolling, would have a different kind of effect. He thought about the intake process. When he had been brought in, his personal effects had been cataloged by the desk officer. The catalog would include the contents of his pockets. He had been given a receipt. He looked at the receipt they had given him, which was in his hand now. On the receipt, listed with his other personal effects, was 1 bottle prescription medication labeled. Labeled. The desk officer had written that word because the desk officer was doing his job correctly, and a labeled bottle was a different category from an unlabeled one. That word labeled was in the official intake documentation. Ezra looked at the receipt. He knew who he needed to speak with. Not a lawyer. He did not have a lawyer, and requesting one took time he did not want to spend. He needed a specific person in a specific role. When the detective assigned to process his case came in a tired man in his early 50s named Wallace. who had the expression of someone who had seen this category of situation too many times to be interested in it. Ezra said, "I would like to speak with the watch commander." Wallace looked at him. Ezra said, "I have a documentation discrepancy I would like to bring to the watch commander's attention before this goes any further. The discrepancy involves the intake record, specifically the characterization of a prescribed and labeled medication as a controlled substance, and I believe the watch commander will want to be aware of it before it becomes part of a formal record that will be difficult to correct later." He said this in the tone of a man presenting information, not making demands. He had learned that the tone was the difference between a request that was heard and a request that was ignored. Wallace left the room. He was gone for 11 minutes. Ezra counted. When he came back, he brought the watch commander, a woman named Hensley, who had 24 years on the department and the specific kind of authority that does not need to announce itself. She had the intake receipt in her hand. She had the antibiotic bottle in a clear evidence bag. She read the label. She read the intake receipt. She looked at Wallace. She looked at Ezra. She said, "Where is Officer Holt?" Wallace said he was in the building. She said, "Get him." What happened next took 40 minutes, which was the time required to establish that the prescription was valid, that the prescribing physician was licensed and present and cooperative, and that the characterization of the medication as a potential controlled substance had been not merely incorrect, but incorrect in a way that the documentation did not support. Hensley conducted this process with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the situation had exposed itself to a specific kind of liability and who intended to address that liability completely. Holt, when he arrived, had lost some of the certainty he had carried in the lot. He answered Hensley's questions with the care of someone choosing each word on a surface that had become unstable. Ezra said nothing during this portion of the process. He had provided the information he needed to provide. He sat with his hands folded on the table and let the facts do what facts do when they are placed in front of people who are required to deal with them. Hensley said, "Mr. Cross, you are free to go. The occupancy matter will be reviewed through the administrative process. The medication issue is resolved." Ezra said, "I would like a copy of the incident documentation, including the intake receipt and the resolution notes." Hensley said, "You are entitled to that." He said, "I would also like Officer Holt's badge number recorded in the notes." Hensley looked at him. Ezra said, "It is a matter of completeness." She recorded it. He walked out of the district station into the January afternoon. They were still there, every one of them. 40 bikes in a row along the street, the riders standing or sitting on their machines, the cold not having moved them in the 8 hours since the arrest. Some of them had gotten food from somewhere, paper bags visible. Some of them had done what long experienced men do during long waits, found the most comfortable available position, and occupied it with the patience of people who had once waited for things considerably more dangerous than this. Wade was at the front, sitting on his bike, his arms folded, not looking at his phone, not talking to anyone near him, looking at the station entrance. When Ezra came through the door, Wade looked at him for a moment. Then he got off the bike. He walked across the space between them without hurrying. He said, "Are you all right?" Ezra said yes. He held up the documentation folder Hensley had given him. He said, "It is already resolved." Wade looked at the folder. He looked at Ezra. Something moved through his expression that took a moment to identify, because it was not what Ezra had expected. It was not satisfaction. It was not the look of a man whose resources had been applied successfully. It was closer to the look of a man who was revising a calculation that had been based on incomplete information and was finding the revised version significant. He said, "You handled that yourself." Ezra said, "It was a documentation problem. I have read a great many documents." Wade was quiet for a moment. Around them, the riders were straightening up the long wait, recognizing that it was over, men adjusting jackets and moving back to their bikes. Axel came to stand a few feet away. He was looking at Ezra with the calculation still running, but it was a different calculation now because some of the variables had changed. He had watched a man come out of 8 hours in custody with his back straight, in a folder of documentation he had assembled himself, and no particular drama about any of it. In Axel's experience, which was substantial and not gentle, this was not how most people came out of 8 hours in custody. He said, "What is in the folder?" Ezra said, "Everything I need to file a complaint about the intake characterization, and a copy of everything that will make it difficult for them to bring the occupancy charge in a form that will survive review. Axel said, "You did that from inside the room." Ezra said, "I asked to speak with the watch commander. I identified the documentation inconsistency. I let the facts do the rest." Axel was quiet. He said, "Holt works for Voss." Ezra said, "I know. This will not be the last move Voss makes." Axel said, "No, it will not." He said it in a way that meant the chapter would be considering this fact seriously, which was different from the way he had looked at Ezra 8 hours ago, when the consideration had been whether Ezra himself was trustworthy. Wade said, "Come on, you need to eat something, and you need somewhere warm." Ezra said, "I have the shelter." Wade said, "The shelter has a compromised joint on the north wall, and you have pneumonia." Ezra said, "I repaired the joint." Wade looked at him with the expression of a man who is deciding whether to push and is assessing the cost of pushing against the cost of letting it go. He said, "There is a room at the chapter house. It is not a favor. It is how in practical matter. You are the foreman of the West Loop project as of Monday morning, which means you are on my payroll as of Monday morning, and I prefer my foreman not to be managing pneumonia out of a shelter in January." Ezra thought about this. He thought about what it meant to accept it and what it meant to refuse it. He had spent 11 months refusing things because refusal was the posture of a man who does not need assistance. And he had maintained that posture because it was true and because it was the only thing keeping certain other things from being true. But he was also plainly and practically a man with pneumonia standing in the January street who was about to start a job on Monday. He said, "I will need my tools from the shelter and the box on the nail above the sleeping area." Wade said, "We will get them." Axel turned and walked back to his bike without comment. But as he walked, Ezra saw it, just briefly. The small, precise nod of a man who has finished a calculation and arrived at a conclusion he did not entirely expect but intends to honor. It was not welcome. It was not warmth. But it was the beginning of something, and in Ezra's experience, beginnings were the thing you kept your eye on. The chapter house was a converted warehouse in a part of the South Side that had the particular character of a neighborhood that had decided to be what it was without apology. The building was solid and warm and smelled of coffee and motor oil, and the particular accumulated presence of a place where a great many people had spent a great deal of time. There were photographs on the walls, long rows of them, chapter members at various points over various decades, bikes and gatherings, and the occasional formal portrait that had the weight of something commemorating. Ezra was given a room on the second floor. It was not large. It had a bed and a window and a chair, and enough space for what he had, which was not much. Someone had put clean towels on the chair and a glass of water on the table beside the bed. He set his things down. He sat on the edge of the bed. He took the small wooden box out of the bag he had carried from the shelter. He opened it. The purple felt inside still held the impression of the metal that had lived there for 12 years. The shape of it was preserved in the material, clear and exact, the way a significant thing leaves its mark on the place where it rested. He closed the box. He lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling of a room that was warm and still, and he listened to his lungs, which were not right but were working, and he let the events of the last 20 hours settle into their proper order and proportion. Outside on the street below, the sound of an engine turning over. One bike, then another. The chapter returning to its ordinary business, whatever that was, the particular machinery of a life organized around different principles than the ones that organize most lives. He thought about Colt Garner at 23, scared in a burning vehicle holding it together anyway. He thought about a letter he had written to an address in Ohio. He thought about a man who had spent 12 years carrying a question about who survived and who did not, and who had sat on the floor of a makeshift shelter this morning with that question finally answered. Looking at Ezra the way you look at something that has changed the shape of something you had come to believe was fixed. He thought about Voss. He thought about the folder of documentation in his bag. He thought about what Voss would do next, which would not be nothing, because men like Voss did not stop when the first approach failed. They regrouped, and they came from a different angle, and they used whatever was still available to them. He needed to know what was still available to Voss, which meant he needed to know what Voss was protecting. The lot was the visible surface of something larger. You did not send a camera crew to the arrest of a homeless veteran over a vacant lot. You did that when the lot was connected to something you needed to control, something whose discovery would cost you more than the cost of the operation you were running to prevent it. Ezra stared at the ceiling. He thought about the zoning documents he had found in the public records months ago when he first arrived at the lot, which he had read because he read everything relevant to his situation and which he had not thought about since, in the way you do not think about information that seems background until it stops being background. The lot had a classification in those documents, a redevelopment classification with a specific funding category attached to it. A federal funding category, Veterans Housing Improvement. He sat up. He thought about the 47 names ahead of him on the housing list. He thought about Mrs. Patterson at window 3 saying the job placement program was suspended budget reallocation. He thought about what budget reallocation meant and where budgets went when they were reallocated and who made the determination of where they went. He reached into his bag and took out the green notebook. He opened to a fresh page. He wrote Commissioner Harlan Voss at the top of the page. He wrote Veterans Housing Improvement Fund beneath it. He drew a line between them. He wrote, find out if these two things are connected, and if they are, find out who knows about it. He wrote it in the neat, precise hand of a man who had been writing field notes for 22 years and understood that the quality of the note was the quality of the thinking. He closed the notebook. He took the first antibiotic tablet of the day on schedule with the water from the glass on the table. Then he lay back and let himself sleep finally and completely for the first time in 30 hours. He slept the way soldiers sleep when the immediate crisis has passed and the next one has not yet arrived fully and without reservation, because the body knows that what is coming will require everything it can restore. Outside Chicago was quiet under its layer of new snow. Something had begun. It had not announced itself. It had not arrived with the machinery that significant things sometimes arrive with. It had arrived the way most significant things arrive, quietly in the middle of something else, wearing the face of an ordinary morning. But it had begun. He started Monday. 6 in the morning. West Loop, the kind of cold that had settled in after the blizzard, not with drama but with permanence, the cold of a Chicago January that has decided it is not a temporary condition, but a geological fact. The construction site was a cleared block where a mixed-use building was going up the steel skeleton, already 3 floors complete. The work paused during the storm and resuming now with the particular momentum of a project that had lost time and knew it. Ezra arrived before the crew. He walked the site in the early gray light with the deliberate attention of someone who needs to understand a space before he can be responsible for it. He walked the perimeter. He walked the interior. He looked at the steelwork, the foundation drainage, the material staging areas, the access points. He found 3 things that were wrong, not dangerously wrong, but wrong in the way that small errors compound when no one is tracking them. And he wrote each one in his green notebook with the date and the specific location and the correction required. The crew arrived at 7. There were 14 of them. They looked at Ezra the way crews look at a new foreman, with the particular reserve of people who have learned that the first impression of a supervisor is rarely the accurate one, and who prefer to form their own assessments over time. They were a mixed group, veterans, several of them, the kind of men who had found their way to construction work through the specific path of people who needed work that was physical and structured and did not require them to perform a version of themselves they did not recognize. Ezra gathered them for 7 minutes. He did not give a speech. He told them the 3 things that needed to be corrected and how he wanted them corrected, and by when. He told them he would be walking the site twice daily and that he expected to be told about problems before they became visible, not after. He told them his name and his background in 1 sentence. Then he said, "Let us get to work." They went to work. By noon, 2 of the 3 corrections were done. The third required a materials delivery that had been scheduled for Wednesday, and Ezra had already called the supplier and moved it to Tuesday afternoon. The crew noticed this. They did not say anything about it, but Ezra had managed enough teams to read the specific quality of silence. That means people are revising their initial assessment in a direction that is useful. He ate lunch sitting on a concrete block with his notebook open, not because he needed to perform industry, but because there was actually work to do in the notebook, the kind of thinking that required a physical record to be done properly. He was mapping Voss. He had spent the evening since Friday at the chapter house with access to a computer and the particular focused attention of a man who knows how to read documents and knows which documents to read. He had started with the city zoning database, which was public record and which contained more information than most people bothered to extract from it because most people did not have the patience or the training to read the way Ezra read. The lot on the south side was classified under a federal program designation he had recognized from his time navigating the VA system. The Veterans Housing and Community Improvement Initiative, a federal block grant program that channeled funds through municipal housing authorities for the purpose of developing housing and community infrastructure specifically designated for veterans. He had looked up the program. He had found the disbursement records, which were also public, which almost no one ever looked at because they were formatted in a way designed to be technically accessible and practically impenetrable. But Ezra had been trained to read logistics reports in conditions where getting the logistics wrong meant people died, which was an education in reading carefully under pressure that civilian data formats could not defeat. The program had disbursed $4.2 million to the City of Chicago Housing Authority over a 3-year period. He had found the project codes associated with those disbursements. He had cross-referenced the project codes with the active development projects in the city database. 3 of the project codes did not match any active development project. $3.1 million associated with project codes that did not exist in the current project registry. He had looked at the project codes more carefully. They had been registered, they had been active, and then they had been closed quietly with a status update that read completed, which in the database meant nothing further was required and nothing further would be looked at. Completed. $3.1 million. No physical projects corresponding to the codes. No veterans housing built. No community infrastructure developed. The money had gone somewhere. He had found in the meeting minutes of the Housing Authority Board, which were public record and which were formatted as though their purpose was to communicate as little information as possible, while technically constituting minutes a series of budget transfers in the period corresponding to the project closures. The transfers were to a capital improvement fund administered by the Deputy Commissioner's Office. The Deputy Commissioner's Office was Harlan Voss. Ezra had written all of this in the green notebook in the neat, precise hand that 22 years of field documentation had given him. He had cross-referenced every number. He had noted every source. He had built the kind of record that was not an accusation, but was the materials from which an accusation could be constructed by someone with the authority to construct it. He was not that person. He knew who was. He was not going to call a lawyer because he did not have one. And because the kind of lawyers available to him in his current situation would take weeks to engage. He was not going to call the police because Officer Bryce Holt had demonstrated the problem with that approach. He was not going to go to the press because the press had been Voss's tool on the morning of the arrest, and he did not yet know which reporters were independent of that relationship. He was going to call the Office of Inspector General for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. This was the federal office responsible for investigating the misuse of federal housing funds. It was not a glamorous office. It did not make the news very often. It processed complaints with the methodical thoroughness of an institution that had been processing complaints for decades and had no particular investment in whether the result was dramatic or not. Ezra had found the correct contact number in the program documentation he had downloaded. He had prepared a summary of the discrepancy, 2 pages single, spaced with every source cited and every number cross-referenced, and a clear statement of the specific regulation that appeared to have been violated. He made the call on Tuesday evening from the common room of the chapter house, sitting at the table with his notebook open and his 2 pages of documentation in front of him. The person who answered was a woman named Sandra, who had the brisk competence of someone whose job required her to distinguish quickly between reports that had substance and reports that did not. He told her what he had found. He told her the specific program name and the disbursement amounts in the project codes and the transfer mechanism and the name of the office the funds appeared to have moved through. He told her he had documentation of all of it available for transmission. He told her he was a United States Marine Corps veteran with 22 years of service and that the funds in question were designated specifically for veterans housing. Sandra asked him 2 clarifying questions. He answered both completely. She said, "Mr. Cross, I am logging this as a priority category complaint. Someone from our Chicago regional office will contact you within 5 business days." He said, "I appreciate that." She said, Do you have secure email for the documentation? He gave her the email address of the chapter house which Wade had made available to him. He sent the documentation that evening. 2 pages, every number cited, every source footnoted. Then he closed his notebook and went to bed. He did not tell Wade. He did not tell Axel. He did not tell anyone in the chapter because the chapter had its own complicated relationship with federal authorities, and because the investigation was not the chapter's to conduct. It was his. He had found the problem. He had the training to document it. He had submitted it to the appropriate authority through the appropriate channel. That was the work. The work did not require an audience. He went back to the site on Wednesday and confirmed the material's delivery was on schedule, and walked the site and found 2 new things to note in the notebook and corrected one of them before the end of the day. The crew was finding their rhythm with him. He was learning their individual capacities, which was the thing a foreman actually needed to know. Not the generalized competence of the group, but the specific strengths and limits of each person in it. There was a man named Curtis who was the best concrete finisher Ezra had seen in 20 years. There was a man named Del Vecchio who had a habit of rushing the last step of any task and whose work needed a specific kind of checking. There was a young man, 24, named Weston, who had the instincts of someone who would be exceptional at this work in 5 years if someone taught him correctly, and who was currently suffering from the lack of that teaching. Ezra began teaching him, directly and without ceremony, the way you teach someone when you have identified both the gap and the capacity to fill it. The week passed in work and cold, in the kind of exhaustion that is productive rather than depleting, the kind that comes from using yourself fully and correctly. On Friday, 9 days after the blizzard, the regional HUD Inspector General's office called. The investigator's name was Gerald Marsh. He had a voice that suggested long experience with situations in which people had done things they believed were cleverly concealed, and he spoke with the deliberate pace of someone who had learned that clarity at the outset prevented confusion at the conclusion. He said he had reviewed Ezra's submission. He said the documentation was, in his words, unusually complete for an initial complaint. He said his office was opening a formal preliminary inquiry and that Ezra would be contacted for a formal statement within 10 days. He said, "Mr. Cross, I want to be straightforward with you. What you have submitted, if it holds up to our forensic review, describes a significant misappropriation, the kind that takes time to prosecute properly, but that tends to prosecute successfully." Ezra said he understood. Marsh said, "I want to ask you directly. Have you shared this with anyone else? Media, law enforcement, any third party?" Ezra said he had not. Marsh said, "I would ask you to keep it that way for now. If this gets into the press before we have completed our preliminary review, it becomes significantly more complicated to handle correctly." Ezra said, "I understand how investigations work. I will not speak to anyone about it until you tell me I can." Marsh was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You were a Marine." Ezra said, "Yes." Marsh said, "Sergeant." Ezra said, "Staff Sergeant." Marsh said, "Understood. We will be in touch." The call ended. Ezra sat for a moment in the quiet of the chapter house common room. He thought about Commissioner Harlan Voss, who at this moment did not know that a federal preliminary inquiry had been opened into his office's handling of veterans' housing funds, who was almost certainly planning his next move against Ezra, unaware that the terrain had changed underneath him while he was still reading the map he had drawn before the blizzard. He thought about the 47 names on the housing list. He thought about Mrs. Patterson at window 3 saying the job placement program was suspended budget reallocation. He thought about what it meant that $3.1 million intended for veterans housing had moved through channels controlled by a man who sent a camera crew to film the arrest of a homeless veteran. He did not allow himself to feel what this meant until he was alone in his room with the door closed and the lights off and the city outside the window going about its business. Then he sat on the edge of the bed and he let himself feel it, not the satisfaction of having acted. That came later. First, beneath the satisfaction, there was something older and heavier. Grief maybe for the 47 men ahead of him on the list who had been waiting for housing, built with money that had been taken from them without their knowledge or their consent. For the men who had come home from places like Kandahar and Fallujah and Ramadi and had trusted that the systems in place were the systems they appeared to be. He sat with this for a while. Then he straightened up and he turned on the light and he went through the evening tasks that maintained the order he kept around himself, and he went to sleep. The weeks that followed had a quality he recognized from his time in the Corps. The quality of a period between the decision and the consequence when the action has been taken, and the outcome is not yet visible, but is in motion. You maintained discipline during these periods. You stayed on task. You did not mistake the waiting for inaction. He went to the site every day. The building was rising, the steel on the fourth floor was going up, and the first floor enclosure work had begun the transformation from skeleton to structure. That was always the moment when a project started to feel like a building rather than an assembly of components. Weston was improving. Ezra noticed it in the way he checked his own work before moving to the next step, a habit he had not had 2 weeks ago. Ezra said nothing about the improvement. He noted it and adjusted his teaching accordingly, which was the appropriate response. Curtis finished a section of concrete work one afternoon that was so clean and true that Ezra stopped and looked at it for a full minute. He told Curtis it was good work. Curtis, who was a man of few words and evident experience with supervisors who did not notice craft, looked at Ezra with the expression of someone recalibrating an expectation. He went to the site. He came back to the chapter house. He took his antibiotics on schedule. His lungs improved incrementally each week, a small, measurable improvement over the week before. Rafferty checked him twice more, and on the second check said his lungs were clearing and that he expected a full resolution within another 3 weeks. Wade checked in the manner of a man who had decided that checking in was appropriate, but who was not going to perform concern. He asked how the site was going. He asked if the room was adequate. He did not ask about Voss or the lot, or any of the things that were presumably in motion on his end through channels Ezra did not know and did not ask about. The relationship between them was finding its shape. It was not simple. It was not the shape of gratitude and obligation which Ezra had been careful to avoid. It was closer to the shape of two men who shared a significant piece of history and had not yet established what that history made them to each other going forward. It was still forming. That was acceptable. Some shapes took time. Axel, to his credit, was practical. He spoke to Ezra about the site work with the directness of someone who had decided that what he had seen in the 2 weeks since the blizzard was sufficient to establish a working basis. He asked technical questions occasionally about structural approaches, about material choices. He had more construction knowledge than his appearance suggested, which Ezra noted without comment. One evening in the third week of February, Axel sat down across from Ezra at the common room table and said, "The video is still moving." Ezra looked up from his notebook. Axel said, "The one from the morning of the arrest. 40 bikes outside the station." Wade, looking at the camera. He said it had been shared broadly by veterans groups and then by broader networks, and that the coverage had shifted in a direction that was not favorable to Commissioner Voss. That the district alderman had issued a statement. That 2 city council members had asked questions in a council session about the veterans' housing redevelopment funds. That someone from the mayor's office had called Wade. Ezra thought about this. He said, "That is useful." Axel said Wade has been careful. He has not made accusations. He has not spoken about the lot. He has said only that the chapter stands by Ezra Cross and that it has concerns about how the matter was handled. Ezra said, "That is the right approach." Axel looked at him. He said, "You already knew this would happen." Ezra said, "I thought it was possible." The image of 40 riders standing in the cold outside a police station is a strong image. Strong images find audiences. Voss used a camera as a tool and it became evidence in the opposite direction. Axel was quiet for a moment. He said the HUD office called Wade this week, asked about the chapter's connection to the Southside lot. Wade told them the truth, which is that the chapter has no ownership interest in the lot and that Ezra is an employee of Morrison Construction. Ezra had not known the HUD office had called Wade. This was the information that adjusted his picture of where the inquiry had reached. He noted it. He said, "What did Wade tell you about the call?" Axel said enough. He stood. He put his coffee cup in the sink. He paused at the door. He said, "You filed the complaint yourself." It was not a question. Ezra said yes. Axel said before Wade had any involvement. Ezra said it was not Wade's complaint to file. Axel stood in the doorway for a moment. The calculation that had been running since the morning of the arrest had the look of something that had reached its conclusion. He said Colt would have liked you. He left. Ezra looked at the door for a moment. Then he looked back at his notebook. He wrote a note about the council members who had asked questions because It was information relevant to how the situation was developing, and he wanted it recorded. Then he kept working. Gerald Marsh called on the first Friday of March. He said the preliminary inquiry had been completed. He said the findings were sufficient to open a full formal investigation. He said his office was coordinating with the FBI Public Corruption Unit, which handled cases involving federal funds and local officials. He said that Commissioner Harlan Voss had been formally notified that he was the subject of an investigation, which meant Ezra could be informed of this now. He said, Mr. Cross, I want to be honest with you about what this means practically. A full investigation of this scope takes time. It will take months, possibly longer, before any formal action. But the preliminary findings are strong. Your documentation was a significant contribution to that. Ezra said he understood. Marsh said, I also want you to know that the investigation has identified the specific project codes you flagged as the central element of the scheme. The funds associated with those codes have been traced. The path is clear. It will hold up. Ezra said, how many veterans does the amount represent in housing terms? Marsh was quiet for a moment. Then he said, based on program cost averages, the funds that were diverted would have been sufficient to provide housing for between 60 and 80 individuals. 60 to 80. Ezra did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, thank you for the update. He put the phone down. He sat with the number for a while. 60 to 80 individuals. Men who had come home and been on lists. Men who had sat in waiting rooms and pulled numbers from dispensers and talked to people behind windows who were doing their genuine best inside a system that had been made to fail them by one man in a good overcoat who had calculated that no one would look closely enough. Ezra had looked closely enough. He wrote the number in his notebook. He wrote it plainly. He did not write anything else on that line. He put the notebook in his bag and went to the site. The building was on the 6th floor now. The work had a momentum that Ezra had worked to establish over 5 weeks, the kind that comes from a crew that trusts each other and trusts the person directing them and has internalized the standards well enough to maintain them independently. It was the thing you built toward as a foreman, this state where the team itself was the quality control mechanism rather than any individual supervision. He walked the site. He signed off on 2 inspections. He talked to Del Vecchio about his finishing work, which had improved considerably, and told him so directly. He checked Weston's progress on the enclosure detail and found it correct and told him that too. In the late afternoon, when the crew was wrapping up, he sat on a concrete block at the edge of the site and looked at what they had built, 6 floors of a building that had been a cleared block 2 months ago. The steel true, the concrete work clean, the kind of thing you can stand and look at and know it will be standing when you are gone. He thought about what he wanted to build next. He had been thinking about it for a while, not with urgency because the present work was demanding and complete, but with the steady background attention of someone who knows that the current chapter is a chapter and not the whole book. He thought about the lot on the south side. He thought about what the lot was intended to be in the original federal program designation before Voss had reclassified it as a revenue opportunity. Veterans housing and community infrastructure. That was the language of the program. That was what the money had been meant to build. The money was gone. The investigation was underway. But the lot was still a lot. And the program, absent Voss's interference, still existed. There were federal housing funds that had not been touched, other disbursements from the same program that were sitting in project accounts waiting for applications. He knew how to read a federal grant application. He had filled out enough forms in 22 years of military service to understand that the forms were navigable if you read them with patience and attention. He had helped other veterans navigate VA paperwork because the paperwork, which was deliberately designed to be difficult, was not actually difficult if you understood its structure. He could write a grant application. He could write one for a Veterans Community Center on the South Side lot. He opened his notebook to a fresh page. He wrote Cross Point Veterans Center at the top of the page. He drew a line under it. He began to write. He did not tell Wade yet. Not because it was a secret, because it was not yet a proposal. It was thinking on paper, which was how thinking became real, and you did not bring thinking to other people until it had become real enough to stand on its own. He worked on it in the evenings after the site. He researched the grant program. He researched the specific application requirements. He researched what similar centers had built in other cities, what they offered, what they cost, What made them function over time rather than open and close? He thought about what veterans needed, which he knew from being one, and from watching others struggle with the particular aftermath of military service, the things that were not injuries in the clinical sense, but that required the same kind of structured support. Work, community, a place that was theirs, organized on principles they recognize. He wrote a program outline. He wrote a budget. He wrote a narrative section explaining the need, which he wrote in the plain declarative style of someone who had learned that the strongest case for something was its honest description. After 3 weeks of evenings, it was a real document, 22 pages, every number justified, every program element connected to a documented need. The kind of document that did not ask for things. It demonstrated them. He printed it at the chapter house, and he read it through twice, and he made corrections, and he printed it again. Then he brought it to Wade. He set it on the table in front of Wade and said, "I would like to propose a project." Wade picked it up. He read it. He read all of it, which took 20 minutes, during which Ezra sat across from him and said nothing. Wade was a man who read things completely before responding, which was a quality Ezra respected. When he finished, Wade set the document down. He said, "You wrote this yourself?" Ezra said yes. Wade said, "In the evenings?" Ezra said yes. Wade was quiet for a moment. He said, "The lot is still technically under the city's administrative review process. The occupancy charge was dismissed, but the ownership question has not been formally resolved." Ezra said, "The ownership question will be resolved by the investigation. When the investigation establishes that the classification of the lot under Voss's redevelopment scheme was irregular, the prior program designation will reassert. The lot reverts to the federal program. A community organization can apply to use it for the program's stated purpose." Wade said, "You have already looked into this?" Ezra said yes. Wade looked at the document again. He said, "This is a real proposal." Ezra said, "I would not have brought it to you if it were not." Wade looked at him across the table with the pale eyes that had looked at him in the shelter and in the common room, and across the various distances that the past 2 months had established, impartially closed. He said, "The chapter will contribute materials and labor from the members who have construction backgrounds. There are more of them than you might expect." Ezra said, "I would appreciate that." Wade said, "Axel will want to be involved in the building phase." Ezra said, "I was counting on it." A pause. Wade said the name. Ezra said, "Cross Point." Wade looked at it on the page for a moment. His expression was not unreadable. It was the expression of a man who is deciding whether to say something that is personal, and who has had enough personal things said and unsaid in recent weeks to understand that the cost of not saying them is sometimes higher than you expect. He said Colt would have been the first one through the door. Ezra said, "I know." They did not say anything else about it. The investigation concluded its public phase in the first week of April. Commissioner Harlan Voss resigned from office on a Tuesday morning, and his attorney issued a statement saying he would cooperate fully with federal investigators, which was the language attorneys use when cooperation is the only remaining option. Officer Bryce Holt was terminated from the department pending the outcome of a separate internal affairs investigation into the medication incident and 2 prior cases that the investigation had surfaced. The Chicago Tribune ran the story on the front page. The headline read, "Federal Investigation Finds Millions in Veterans Housing Funds Diverted Through City Officials." The story mentioned Ezra's name once in the 4th paragraph as a veteran whose complaint to the HUD Inspector General had initiated the inquiry. One sentence. Ezra read the story at the site on his phone during the lunch break. He read it once. He put the phone in his pocket. Curtis looked over at him and said, "You going to say anything about it?" Ezra said. "The concrete for the 5th floor exterior is arriving Thursday. I want the forms ready by Wednesday afternoon." Curtis looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Delvecchio. Then they both looked back at their lunch. It was enough. It was more than enough. The lot was formally restored to the Federal Housing Program designation in late April, 6 weeks after Voss's resignation, through the same administrative process that had been used to reclassify it, and that now, absent the official who had corrupted it, operated correctly. The program office in Washington approved the community center application in May, which was unusually fast, and Ezra suspected that someone at the regional HUD office had exercised some informal influence on the timeline, which was not something he would ever be able to confirm, in which he chose to regard as a system working the way it was designed to work. Construction began in the second week of May. It was different from the West Loop project, which was a commercial building with defined specifications and an established crew. This was something that was being built by a combination of Morrison Construction employees, Hells Angels chapter members with construction backgrounds, and a rotating group of volunteers from veterans organizations who had heard about the project and wanted to be part of it. The mix required a different kind of management, the kind that accounted for varying skill levels and varying degrees of familiarity with construction protocols and the particular intensity of people who are building something personal. Ezra managed it the way he managed everything, by knowing exactly what he had, by placing people in roles that use their capacities correctly, by being specific about standards and patient about the process of meeting them. Axel was there from the first day. He came in work clothes rather than colors, and he did not announce himself, and he did not wait to be assigned. He looked at what was needed, and he did it. He had the particular efficiency of a man who had spent his life doing physical work and knew how to make himself useful without creating noise around it. By the end of the first week, Axel and Ezra had developed the working shorthand of people who have figured out each other's methods. No excess communication. Accurate information exchanged at the necessary moments. Standards maintained without being constantly reiterated because both of them understood the standards and applied them without reminder. There was an afternoon in the third week of construction when they were working on the framing for the main hall, and Axel was running the level along a top plate, and it came back perfect, and he handed the level to Ezra without a word, and Ezra checked it and handed it back, and neither of them said anything. That was what it had become, not friendship in the declarative sense, something more functional and perhaps more durable. Two men who knew what they were doing working on the same thing. The building rose through the summer. It was not large. It was not elaborate. It was precisely what the proposal had described and nothing more, which was a small building with a large common room and 8 private offices for counseling and services in a commercial kitchen in an exterior space that could be used in warm months for events and gatherings. Everything structural was built to last. The finished work was done carefully. The pantry was one of the last things Ezra worked on personally. He built the shelves himself in the evenings after the crew had left using hardwood he had sourced and cut himself. He built them deep and strong, and he installed them with the same precision he brought to everything. When the shelves were done, he opened the pantry door and stood and looked at them for a while. He thought about a different kind of shelter, about supplies arranged along a wall, about the discipline of keeping what you had organized, knowing precisely what the distance was between what you had and what you needed. He reached up and unlocked the pantry. He removed the lock entirely. He set it on the floor. He looked at the open shelves. He left the pantry door open when he left that evening. He did not close it behind him. He did not know who would notice or when, but it seemed important that it be open. It seemed important that the first person who saw it would know, without being told that the food would be there when they needed it. The box arrived on a Saturday morning in mid-September, 2 weeks before the scheduled opening. Ezra was at the site alone doing the final walkthrough with his notebook, checking every room against the specifications and noting the small corrections that final inspections always find. He was in the main hall when he heard a truck outside. He went out and found a Morrison construction van parked at the entrance with one of the younger chapter members at the wheel who handed him a clipboard and said Wade had sent something and left quickly in the manner of someone who had been told to deliver and not explain. On the ground beside the van was a small wooden box, Ezra's wooden box. He recognized it immediately and completely. The grain of the wood, the small wear mark on the lower right corner where it had rested against the nail that held it for 12 years, the faded cloth visible through the gap where the lid sat. He picked it up. He carried it inside. He sat down on the floor of the main hall, which had the particular quality of a space that is ready but has not yet begun, that it holds its breath before its first breath. He opened the box. The Purple Heart lay on the felt interior. It was clean. It had been polished not dramatically, just returned to what it was, the bronze bright and the ribbon deep and correct. There was no note. Wade had not left a note. There was nothing to explain. The box was there. The metal was in it. That was the communication complete and sufficient in itself. And Ezra looked at the metal for a long time. He thought about the counter at Earl Dunbar's shop and the $50 and the drive home through the blizzard with $47 of medication in his pocket and 3 left over. He thought about the man on the floor of the shelter and the color returning to his lips and the breathing stabilizing and the decision to go back out into the cold having been finally and in retrospect the correct one. He thought about Colt Garner, 23 years old, holding it together in a burning vehicle. He thought about Ray Garner, which was not the name of the man in the vehicle, but the name from the shelf of his memory where he had kept it for 12 years, and he thought that he had spent 12 years thinking of that name as a loss when in fact it was something else. It was a thread, the kind that does not break, the kind that runs through things, through time, through the people connected to the person, through the meaning made from what could not be undone. He sat on the floor of the main hall of Cross Point Veterans Center with the wooden box open in his hands and the summer light coming through the new windows. And then Ezra Cross, who had not cried at the pawn shop and had not cried in the shelter and had not cried in the interview room or outside it or through any of the weeks and months that had followed, allowed himself to cry now. Not from grief, not from loss, from the particular release of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has finally arrived at the place where he can set it down and who understands in setting it down how heavy it was. He cried for a few minutes. Then he stopped. He closed the box. He stood up. He finished the walk through. The opening was on this first Saturday of October. The weather was the weather of early fall in Chicago, the brief, clear cold that comes before the heavy cold, the kind that makes the city look like a photograph of itself. The morning light was flat and specific and very clean. People arrived beginning at 9. Not just the chapter, though the chapter was there in numbers. Veterans from organizations across the South Side. Families. Mrs. Patterson from the VA office at Window 3, who had driven herself and who stood near the back with her glasses on their beaded chain, and the expression of someone who is deeply satisfied by something and is not trying to hide it. Representatives from the Federal Housing Office. Reporters, 2 of them, who had been told that the event would be brief and would not include statements about the investigation, only about the center. Rafferty was there with his doctor's bag over his shoulder out of habit. Gerald Marsh from the HUD office was there having driven from Springfield, which Ezra had not known he was going to do, and which he registered without letting himself show how much it registered. Wade arrived last with Axel beside him and stood near the door. Ezra spoke for 7 minutes. He did not have notes. He did not need them. He said what the center was for, which was to provide veterans in the South Side with access to services community in a place that was theirs. He said what it had cost to build, which he gave as a number that included the materials contribution from the chapter and the volunteer labor and the federal grant, because accuracy in accounting was how you demonstrated that the resources had been used correctly. He said the name of the center and why it was named what it was. He said the center was named Cross Point because a cross point was a navigation term. It was the point at which 2 lines of movement intersected, the point at which different trajectories met. He said that every person in the room was the result of lines of movement intersecting in ways that none of them had planned, and that what you did at the cross point, whether you kept moving in your original direction or changed course based on what you found, there was the thing that determined what came next. He said, this building is a cross point. He said, come inside. People came inside. The common room filled. The kitchen produced food, real food prepared by 2 chapter members who had apparently been cooking for the Brotherhood for years and who had approached the task of providing for the opening with the seriousness it deserved. Coffee. Good coffee. The kind that required attention and produced results. Ezra moved through the room. He spoke to people and listened to people and showed people the counseling offices and the resource library and the pantry with its open door and its deep hardwood shelves that he had built himself. He showed no one the wooden box. The box was in the small office he had designated as his own, the one at the back of the building with the window that looked onto the exterior space, the one he had claimed. Not because it was the best office, but because it was the most private and because there were things he needed to do in his work that required a door. At the end of the afternoon, when most of the people had gone and the chapter members were cleaning up with the efficiency of people accustomed to breaking down after events, Ezra went to his office. He took the wooden box from his bag. He looked at the wall above his desk. He had put a single nail in the wall in the center at eye level. He hung the box on the nail. He stepped back. The box hung on the wall of his office in a building he had built on a lot that had been intended all along for this purpose, and the metal inside the box was not a record of something taken or traded or lost, but a record of a man who had done the thing required, when the thing required was hard, which was the only record that had ever mattered in any life he had admired. He looked at it for a long moment, then he went back out to help clean up. 1 year after the blizzard on a January morning, Chicago was cold in the steady geological way of a city that has accepted winter as a fact. The sky was low and white, and the streets had the look of a city that had been through things and intended to keep going. Ezra Cross arrived at Cross Point Veterans Center at 6 in the morning. He arrived at 6 every morning. He had a key, and he let himself in, and he made coffee in the commercial kitchen, and he sat at his desk with the coffee and his green notebook and the day's work in front of him. The center had been open for 3 months. It had served 61 veterans in that time. Some had come once and not returned, which was their right. Some came every day. The services were developing the shape of what was needed rather than the shape of what had been assumed, which was the correct way for a service to develop. There was a housing referral program now. There was a job placement partnership with 4 construction firms, Morrison Construction among them. There was a peer support group that met on Tuesday evenings and had 6 regular members, and sometimes more. There was a refrigerator in the common room that was always stocked and that operated on the same principle as the pantry shelves. Always there, never locked, food available until you were finished. Ezra opened his notebook to the current page. He read through what he had written the previous evening, which was notes from a meeting with the VA regional office about a formal partnership for benefits navigation services. He added 2 items that he had thought of overnight and that needed to be addressed before the meeting follow-up was sent. He looked at the application files on his desk. He read through each of them with the complete attention he brought to every document, because every document represented a person, and every person deserved the precision. He had 47 veterans currently engaged with the center in some capacity. 47. The number was not accidental, and he was aware that it was not accidental. He had not designed it that way. It had simply arrived as numbers sometimes do, carrying its history and its composition. He wrote a note in the margin of one application. He initialed it. He looked up at the wooden box on the wall. The light in the office in early morning is the light of a working space before the work has started, clean and preparatory, the light of possibility rather than achievement. The box caught some of it and threw back what it could. Outside, Chicago was beginning. A city of 3 million people waking up and going about its business. The vast majority of its mornings ordinary, and its extraordinary mornings indistinguishable in advance from the ordinary ones. The blizzard had been one of those mornings. The night of the blizzard had been the night a motorcycle had gone down in the snow outside a lot on the south side, and a man inside the lot had heard it and had gone out. That was the whole story. Not in the sense of being small, in the sense of being complete. A man had heard something and gone out. What followed had followed from that, the chain of it running forward through the months and the work in the building, and the 47 files on the desk, and the open pantry, and the nail on the wall, running all the way forward to this ordinary January morning with the low white sky and the coffee and the green notebook and the day's work waiting. Ezra Cross picked up his pen. He opened the next file. He went to work.